In this video, we're going to be going over the top 10 reasons water's leaking out of your toilet tank handle. Actually, that's a lie. There's probably only one reason it's leaking out of your toilet tank handle, and that's because the overflow tube is above the level of the handle. But there are a couple other things you need to know before you go cutting the overflow tube, and in this video, we're going to go over all of them. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and hit that notification bell so you'll be notified of when I post a new video. Stick around, I'll be right back after the intro. All right, so what you're looking at here is your everyday toilet tank. Now, this is not every toilet tank in America. Some of them may be bigger, some of them may be smaller. This is your average everyday toilet tank that I walk in and service. So don't take this as gospel across the board information for every toilet tank ever manufactured. Anyway, what you're looking at is a fair representation of a fluid master fill valve. And let me just say my process for putting a fill valve in a toilet tank, and it's just something I've gotten used to and I do it now all the time. And I used to put them in without really adjusting them or opening them up all the way. Or in my case, I generally set them about 1 inch below the top of the toilet tank. I used to put them in a little lower, and then after I got done with the installation, I realized I couldn't get enough water in the tank to make it flush. Ultimately, I had to readjust it and raise it, and that's kind of a pain in the neck to do once you have everything all in and connected. So rather than avoid that in the future, I extend them. I take that fill valve height adjustment, I back off that ring, I raise the fill valve as high as I can get it, generally about 1 inch below the top. There have been cases where I've set the top even with the top of the toilet tank. Depends on the size of the tank, depends on the height of the overflow tube. A couple of things that may influence me in making my decision, but for the most part, I set it 1 inch below the top of the toilet tank. Now, what you're looking at here is, again, your everyday toilet tank. And the problem comes in when I get a call from a customer who says they see water leaking out of the tank handle. And when I get there, I see the water streaming down out of the handle, and they usually have a bucket there on the left-hand side. I lift up the toilet tank, I look inside, and I can see that the overflow tube is above the level of the handle. And that could be a problem, especially if that fluid master fill valve decides to give up the ghost and start putting water in there full flow. It's going to be a real issue. And if you're home, you'll probably catch it. If you're not home, that's when the issue comes in, because this thing will go all day long. And if you're in an apartment where you have people below you and water is leaking uncontrollably on the floor, it could turn into a problem. But at any rate, on most fill valves, you're going to see a critical level. There's a CL level marked on the fill valve, and you should look at it before you install it. And what most codes state is that the overflow tube should be approximately 1 inch below that critical level. And that's probably because you need a fair amount of room if that valve were to fail and start putting water in there at full flow. I mean, that water has to flow into that overflow tube, and it has to kind of keep up with the incoming flow in order for it not only to come out of the tank handle, but to actually end up going over the top of the toilet tank. I can't say that I've ever seen that happen, but I'm sure with some older style fast fill valves, it's quite possible. But at any rate, what I did was I made a diagram of an extended overflow tube there in red. And if you follow that dotted line across to the left, you can see that that's above the area where the handle is installed. And when the handle goes through the tank, it's just the handle going through with a nut. Sometimes it's got a friction washer. Some of them have gaskets on them, rubber gaskets. The better made handles have rubber gaskets, but for the most part, they don't. And if water gets above there, it's just going to leak out. It's plain and simple. So in order to eliminate that, you are going to have to get that overflow tube cut down to 1 inch below that critical level. And it's relatively simple. I mean, if you measure from the bottom of the toilet tank up to the critical level, then transfer that mark across to the overflow tube, and deduct the 1 inch, and that's where I would cut the overflow tube. Now, you can cut them with a tubing cutter. You can cut them with a hacksaw. I generally use a little hacksaw blade. I don't use a hacksaw because you're not going to fit that inside of the toilet tank. Or I use my Lennox mini saw, which does a great job. And pretty much that's the basically outline of this video. Now, if you had more room in the tank where the tank was a little higher and you could raise the refill valve to get that 1 inch, then you won't have to cut the overflow tube. But you're going to have to get that to the point where you ultimately want enough water inside the toilet tank to flush the contents away. If you don't have enough water, the bowl's got to kind of like half flush. I can't say that you could ever have too much water. Well, you may get a double flush, but, a double flush is better than no flush. And what I'll do is I will throw paper in the toilet bowl and I will flush it and I will observe and make sure that all the contents and all the paper goes down. If not, I make my fine adjustment from that float height adjustment, which is on some fluid masters, a little metal clip, and you can raise and lower that float. And I generally like to get my water level about a ½ inch below the overflow tube. And pretty much that's it. No brain surgery. Now listen, a lot of times guys will go in and replace that flush valve. And the flush valves, depending upon the manufacturer, they will have longer overflow tubes on them. And you put that inside of the existing toilet tank, and maybe the one you took out is a little shorter. You're going to have to make adjustments. If you have to cut it, you have to cut it. Now, the final thing I wanted to say about this was, now, if you look at that refill tube, what the refill tube does is replenish the water seal in the toilet bowl so that you have a nice water seal there, and it's high enough so that when you flush the tank, everything evacuates from the bowl. But often I find the refill tube popped out of the overflow tube, and what's happening is it's just releasing the water into the toilet tank, and then you look inside the bowl, and the bowl has very little water in it. So I get the question is, it used to have more water in it. What do you think? What do you think's going on there? And I'll lift up the tank cover, and sure enough, the refill tube has popped out of the overflow tube. And the other thing I wanted to say about that refill tube is this. Now, they come relatively long out of the box. And what I find more often than not is that people will just connect them to the fill valve and they will just shove them down inside of the overflow tube. And that's something you shouldn't do. If you shove that refill tube inside the overflow tube below the water line, what's going to happen is when that fill valve shuts off, ultimately, is it's going to siphon water from the bottom of the tank. And after everything has shut, you're going to hear a little dripping, a little piddling, I hear something leaking. What's going on? And you're going to drive yourself crazy adjusting the flapper, thinking you need a new flapper or a different flapper, or you didn't make the right adjustment on the fill valve. And that's just not the case. It's sucking water up from the bottom of the toilet tank and very gently depositing it inside the overflow tube. Because when a toilet tank fills up, the water, it fills from the bottom up. It comes out of the bottom of the fill valve. And I put those little watery splashy things there so you could see where the water actually comes from when the tank fills. So if this shuts off abruptly and you have that refill tube shoved down below the ultimate water line, it will start to siphon. So what you have to do is, usually in the box, there's a clip. They supply you with a clip to clip onto the overflow tube so you could stick the refill tube in there, and the refill tube should ideally be above the overflow tube. So with that said, guys, pretty much that's it. We're going to jump down on the bench. I'll get one of my toilet tanks out. We'll do some measurements. I'll kind of show you what I do. And hopefully, if you have this situation in your own house, you can correct it. Hopefully without calling a guy like me. All right, I'll see you on the bench. All right, so before we jump over to the toilet tank, I just have two fill valves here. This is the typical Fluid Master here on the left, and on the right, this is made by Wolverine. This is a company I buy from often, and I just wanted to show you on these valves here. You have to look on the valve to note the critical level, and there is the critical level on this one, and I had to use a marker because it's, if you don't really kind of look, it's very hard to see the letters are there. So that is the critical level on the Fluid Master. And on the Wolverine brass version, there is the critical level. And generally, when you get these in the box, you know, they're screwed down pretty much all the way. They're not maxed out, obviously, to fit them in the box, otherwise it would take up a lot more room. And what I do generally, before I even get started or even, you know, go anywhere else, when I put a fill valve in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust it to within 1 inch below the top of the tank. And to do that simply with this Fluid Master version, you just push this little stop back, and then you can extend it. You can extend it, and again, I get it to where the top of this is 1 inch below the toilet tank. Once I get it where I want it, it's just a matter of not forgetting to push this lock ring back, because if you don't push the lock ring back and you turn the water on, I mean, this thing is gonna, you know, it's not gonna pop off, but it's gonna extend to its max. It'll hit the bottom of the tank cover, and you don't want that to happen. So that's a Fluid Master version, and actually this refill tube is from the other valve, but I just wanted to show you that most of these, and this one was cut, by the way. This one was cut. It was much longer, but it comes with a little clip here, and that clip clips onto the overflow tube, and the idea is that the water from the refill tube has got to be above the level of the overflow tube. But very often I find these shoved down all the way past the water level of the toilet tank, and as a result, when this valve shuts, it starts to siphon from the bottom, and you'll get dripping, and you'll think something's leaking, and you'll drive yourself crazy. Now, unlike the one in the diagram, this particular Fluid Master is an updated version of the one I showed in the diagram. The one in the diagram has a little metal squeeze clip here, where you can squeeze the clip, and you can raise the float up and down. On this version, it's just simply a matter of getting a screwdriver in there, and you can fine tune the dial with a screwdriver either up or down. So that's basically what I do before I move on to do anything else. I adjust the height to within 1 inch below the top of the toilet tank, which ensures me I'm going to have enough water in the tank. Same thing with this one, a little different in terms of you know, the mechanism. I mean, you pull this back, and you can twist it, and it'll extend or it'll close. And again, you want to make sure you put this locking ring back on here. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the thing is going to end up popping up and out. There it is, and that's locked. So here's where the refill tube goes, right here. And this adjustment, again, like the Fluid Master, you get a screwdriver. I mean, a lot of times you can do this with your hand. And this is going to adjust this float up and down, which is going to fine tune the height of the water, which I like to get about a ½ inch below the overflow tube. And just in case you're wondering, yes, both these valves need a gasket on the bottom. So don't forget, don't leave that gasket out. Otherwise, you're going to have a leak. That goes on. This would go in, and then you would put your lock nut on the bottom and tighten that up. And, you know, depending upon where the overflow tube is located, I kind of will direct the refill tube toward the overflow tube, you know, rather than try to, you know, twist this in a crazy configuration. I like to go directly in. You know, sometimes the overflow tube is set to the left, sometimes it's set to the back, sometimes it's set to the right. You got to look inside the toilet tank and determine which way you want to have this facing. And then the other thing to take into consideration is the fact that different toilet tank manufacturers have different configurations. A lot of these sit in the corner, in the left-hand corner, and you don't have a lot of choices in terms of which way to turn this. If you turn this too much to the left or too much to the right, sometimes the float will hit the tank. This float has to be free-flowing. It cannot hit the tank. It has to be free-flowing. If it hits the tank and it gets stuck, it either won't shut off, and that's a bad thing. So with that in mind, now that we kind of got an idea of the critical level on both these valves here, I will go over to the toilet tank and we'll discuss exactly how to go about business. All right, as you can see here, I have my fluid master set in place. I have the top of it 1 inch below the top of the toilet tank. I measured up from the bottom of the tank up to where that mark that said critical level is. I transferred that mark to the back of the toilet tank over here. I put a pencil mark. You can use a marker, use a piece of tape, use whatever you have to use. Now, this flush valve in this particular toilet tank was changed. The original factory flush valve had a much lower overflow tube. And these are the things that you got to keep an eye out for when you're retrofitting a toilet tank. When you're going from, let's say, an original part and you go into one of the big box stores and you're getting replacement parts, because you may have to adjust. So in this case here, you can see that this overflow tube is way, way too high. And you have to cut this at 1 inch below the critical level. So you can either measure up from the bottom of the toilet tank to 1 inch below your mark, or you can set a level across the top of the tank and then measure down from the level, but you want to be 1 inch below the critical level of the fill valve. And then the simplest thing to do, guys, is I found if you get a hacksaw blade, and you get a hacksaw blade with about 32 teeth per inch, which is a very fine blade, you can come in here and very simply cut the top of these overflow tubes off. Steady and straight, and you can get a relatively smooth cut. Now, I've seen a lot of cases where guys will put their tubing cutter on here, copper tubing cutter, which will cut plastic, but you have to make sure it's going to clear the back of the tank. Now, if this overflow tube was here on the left or was on the right, you'd be able to do that. But in the current position, I don't think you'd be able to clear a tubing cutter behind here. So you can either get a hacksaw blade, 32 teeth per inch, or I use a Lennox mini saw. I'll leave links down below this video with all the tools I use, to go through a project like this. And I don't know if you can see it in this video, but in the top of this tank here, right here, I got my finger through the hole. There's a hole in the back of the tank. And I measured up from the bottom of the tank, and that hole measures 10 3/4 center from the bottom of the toilet tank, which is the exact same measurement to the center of the hole where this handle goes through. Now, in this particular case here, this is a beefy brass replacement handle, and it's got a gasket under it. And I can tell you that if this thing did fill up to the level of this handle, it probably wouldn't leak out of the handle for two reasons. A, there's a gasket here, and it'll leak out of the hole in the back of the tank here. Now, you have to pay attention to the specific manufacturer of your tank. Some tanks have a series of holes in the back. I've seen them with 3 holes in the back. I've seen them with 4 holes in the back. I've seen them with 1 big hole at different levels. So you have to take into consideration your critical level, the holes in the back of the tank, the distance from the hole where the handle is located, and you want to fine-tune everything to get it to the point where ultimately what you're looking to do is once you hit that flapper and the water leaves the tank, the bowl flushes completely. That's the goal. But if you ever get a complaint or you ever notice water leaking out the tank lever handle, that means that this fill valve is probably running on, and if you lift the tank cover up, what you're going to find is that this overflow tube is way too high. Now, real quickly, here's the refill tube. This refill tube belongs above the overflow tube. They give you this clip, and you simply clip this on here, and that's the way it should go in. Now, this refill tube was cut, but I'm going to say this. What I find often is that this refill tube is shoved down past the water line. And when this valve ultimately shuts, it'll siphon water from the bottom of the refill valve. And you'll get this slight little trickle of water. It'll be a little trickle, little piddle, if you will. And you'll be sitting there going, what the heck is that? I just replaced the flapper. I just put a new fill valve in. Why is it still leaking? And you'll start adjusting things, and you're going to be wasting your time. Before you do that, I think what you should do is make sure that this refill tube is not shoved down in that hole. And there's probably a clip in the box. Use the clip and clip it above the overflow tube, and you are going to be good to go. So guys, there it is. That's how you make adjustments regarding your critical level, regarding water leaking out of your tank handle. And yeah, I hope I solved some of your problems in this video. So folks, there it is. It's no big mystery. If you follow my diagram in this video, you should get a pretty good handle on how to adjust the height of your fill valve, note the critical level, and then cut the overflow tube off at the proper height, if it is in fact higher than it should be. Anyway, folks, if you're enjoying the videos, I would appreciate it if you subscribe. Also hit that notification bell so you'll be notified of when I post a new video. Also keep an eye out here for one of these two videos that are going to pop up here to my right. One of them YouTube shows, one of them I chose. Folks, I'm honored you stopped by the channel as always. I want to say I'm looking forward to seeing you in my next video. Stay well, and as always, happy plumbing.